Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this second Resilience Dialogue. My name is Roger Morier. I'm a communications officer here at the World Bank. This is the second Resilience Dialogue after the first one, which took place last September in the margins of the World Bank, IMF annual meetings in this very building, actually. And today you are going to hear from panelists who are going to talk about what has taken place since then and also what remains to take place on this important agenda about reducing risk from natural hazards. This event is being co-hosted by the government of Japan, by the European Commission, by the European Union, by the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, and by the World Bank. And in order to welcome you formally to the event, let me introduce the Managing Director of the World Bank, Mahmoud Mohyeldin.
Well, thank you so much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, colleagues. It is my pleasure to welcome you all today. The European Union, the Government of Japan and the World Bank are jointly hosting this second dialogue on resilience to move towards a common framework of action. At our first meeting in September last year, we agreed to close the loop between humanitarian and development interventions to reduce disaster risks for a sustainable tomorrow for all. We identified key priorities to make resilience a core development imperative. Yeah, ignore that. Right? Why is disaster risk reduction important? Why the World Bank should be involved? We have too often witnessed how disasters could roll back years of development progress. Between 1970 and 2010, disasters caused more than 3.3 million deaths and 2.3 trillion in damages. On top of that, we now need to prepare for a changing world. Rapid urbanization and a changing climate are reshaping the exacerbating disaster risks. A recent analytical work by the bank is estimating that by 2050, over 1.5 billion people will be exposed to storms and earthquakes in large cities. Let me share with you what the bank has done to help countries become more resilient. We have established disaster risk reduction as a practice group at the World Bank. We have staffed up and invested $6 billion in the last 6 years in disaster risk reduction to support countries integrate resilience in their development strategies. This is paying off. 7 out of 10 country partnership strategies address natural disaster risks, compared with 4 out of 10 countries 5 years ago. Rachel Kite, my colleague, our Vice President for Sustainable Development, will be speaking to you about how she has made resilience an integral part of our green growth and sustainable development agenda. Let me tell you about some other areas in which we are focusing our attention on. Knowledge. Knowledge is key. Countries have to be able to understand the risks they are facing and prepare accordingly. We have facilitated free access to our knowledge products through the Bank Group's Open Data Initiative. This includes the Open Data for Resilience Initiative with active projects in 20 countries. We support investments in strengthening... All right, thank you. Well, I assume that I shouldn't repeat the whole thing from the beginning here. So, we support investments in strengthening the hydrometeorological services, including early warning systems. These are some of the best investments that a country can make. In the specific case of flooding in Bangladesh, we have found that $1, only $1 invested in hydromet services can help avoid as much as $550 of losses. But information is not the only way to be prepared. Financial mechanisms have to be set up to provide contingent financing when disaster strikes. We are helping countries set up risk transfer and insurance mechanisms that can help in the post-disaster economic management. We have invested in innovative instruments like the catastrophic deferred drawdown options for the Philippines and the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility for Haiti. With your support, we have mobilized under the new IDA 16 crisis response window an additional $250 million for the $1.2 billion drought response plan for the Horn of Africa. This demonstrated our improved capacity to respond rapidly to disasters there. As many of our distinguished guests will note, we have also reached out to our partners to support key initiatives to strengthen our joint efforts on resilience. The bank is partnering with the government of Japan to distill and widely disseminate the lessons learned from last year's tragic earthquake and tsunami. We are working with the Mexican G20 presidency and the OECD to promote new standards to improve risk assessment for global disaster and climatic risk hotspots. Actually, this is the third event, but this is the biggest of them all, that the issue of disaster risk management has been discussed in this very day. In the G20 context, with a group of private sector and investment bankers considering a potential role for the private sector, and this, of course, the big event that's going to be dealing with different aspects of disaster risk management. Ladies and gentlemen, looking ahead to the outcomes of our dialogue today, I know that we can build on what has been achieved so far. I know that we can strengthen the enabling environment for even more effective prevention and resilience. Geography need not be destiny, and the future, however uncertain and unpredictable, when we factor in the impact of climate change, need not be feared if correct preventive policies are taken today. That was the key message of the joint World Bank United Nations report on the economics of disaster prevention, natural hazards, and natural disasters. It remains a key reference for finance and planning ministers, as well as development partners, on the effective policies to prevent deaths and destruction from natural hazards. There is much we can do together to build resilience in communities and nations, to build international consensus and country ownership, to continue investing in measuring risk and informing decision-making for increased resilience, to complete work on globally accepted metric to assess urban disaster risk and could be applied to cities across the world. Such metric will let us analyze cities according to their level of risk and define a baseline against which to measure progress towards building greater resilience. To continue the dialogue on how to better measure our progress towards building greater resilience. Or, put it very simply, for us here in the bank to cooperate and to help governments, societies, and the private sector included as well in building and establishing the 5 pillars of comprehensive approach of resilience and disaster risk management. For adequate risk identification, for risk mitigation, for risk financing, and for getting the countries, societies, governments, and the private sector to get prepared. And finally, for the reconstruction. These are few areas where we can make real progress through initiatives such as this resilience dialogue. I look forward to outcomes of today's panel's discussion that brings us closer together in our efforts to be worthy of this kind of reliance on us to deal with the big challenges in disaster risk management. I wish you all very productive discussion. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mahmoud. Let me now call on another co-host of this event to offer some opening remarks, and that is Andris Pilbags, who is the European Union Commissioner for Development.
Good afternoon, and I'm very glad that this event makes such a good audience. Well, in Development Commissioner's life, one day each year stays especially as a special day. And it is the day when OECD Development Assistance Committee announces the figure of official development aid. This year it was the 4th of April, and well, we have not done as good as I hoped, but it also was not so bad as I feared. But when I see the figure and see that the disaster losses in 2011 has been estimated to the level of 264 billion US dollars, it definitely demonstrates what resilience is building is necessity. Because it was twice that was official development aid in 2011. So it's very clear the reason what we are addressing here. And it's very clear that one part of our development assistance always will go with political resilience building, because good governance, support to democracy and human rights prevents losses through the coup d'etats that happen now in Mali or Guinea-Bissau, and we never quite try to express these losses in the amounts because it's rather difficult to evaluate it. But very clear that we have limited funds and they should be invested very clearly in building resilience. The EU is already involved in this resilience commitments and approaches. Well, we are coordinating planning and programming among humanitarian development actors to deliver common analysis and joint definitions of priorities. We are developing new, more flexible EU financial instruments. We are increasing our focus on resilience and capacity building at the government level and community levels. We are allocating more to prevention, preparedness, and resilience in humanitarian aid and development budgets, while also advocating DRR inclusions on government agendas. My colleague Kristalin Georgieva, EU Commissioner for Humanitarian Assistance, and myself very much are focusing on a couple of regions where we really need to be faster and more effective compared with others. And particularly one region I would mention is supporting Horn of Africa resilience. It's so-called SHARE initiative that we have presented recently during the Danida's 50 years celebrations. So this initiative moved forward. We have also recently developed joint humanitarian development framework, guided the analytical work underpinning the proposed response. Regular joint consultations have led to common agenda for action. Ideas basically concentrates about three main components: improving the way humanitarian development assistance interact, boosting of the value of our assistance in short term, and longer-term commitment in a number of strategic areas that will help address the root causes of food security problems in the Horn. The linear model of emergency relief followed by recovery programming does not quite apply in the Horn, and in the SHARE initiative we intend to go further. We are improving our joint analysis of the causes of and common responses to crisis situations, building on our respective comparative advantages with flexibility to react to realities on the ground. And we will step up joint learning from the experiences of resilience projects. SHARE contains a short-term package of recovery assistance worth more than 250 million euro, covering Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia in the Eastern Horn. The other regions that we are very much focusing is Sahel. We have put together a Sahel strategy to address the development and security issues. A new package of 164.5 million euro is currently being put forward to respond to food crisis in the region, on the top of 123 million euro mobilized for humanitarian assistance. As regards the policy on disaster reduction and resilience, the EU's 60 million euro contribution to the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery addresses prevention, mitigation, and preparedness in relation to natural hazards in ACP states. Other EDF-funded interventions in support of Africa's Union's DRR strategy will follow. Disaster Preparedness ECHO program and Drought Resilience Program funded by the Commission through its humanitarian aid service ECHO have been vital in supporting such strategies. Ladies and gentlemen, At the same time, I could recognize that we need to have quite a lot of analysis and discussion. And I'm very glad that this event will encourage debate on how to improve resilience and better take crisis situations into account in rural development and food security programs, and going also beyond it. To that end, we need really one precondition, that there is full cooperation between humanitarian aid and development actors. Thank you very much, and successful debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Peelbag. Well, as we know, the discussion we're going to have in a few moments, as an input into that discussion, we thought we would have some expert advice about these various issues. We all know that climate change is going to increase the risk from natural hazards, and we all know that there are the links between climate change, adaptation to it, and disaster resilience. We know that's very real. So we've asked somebody from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to come, and that is Dr. Christopher Field. He is the co-chair of the IPCC Working Group Number 2, but what's most important is that they have just completed a new report entitled Managing the Risk of Extreme Events and Disasters to Advance Climate Change Adaptation. So let me call on Dr. Field to come and make a presentation about what the IPCC has found.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you a little bit about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and its new report. As you may know, the IPCC is a uniquely effective tool for bringing the knowledge and perspective of the scientific community into contact with the policy process. In this special report on climate extremes and disasters, for the first time, the IPCC has integrated the perspective of the climate science community, the climate change adaptation community, the disaster risk reduction community, and the sustainable development community. We really have the whole package of what's known about changing risks of climate extremes and disasters. The starting point for the analysis is the well-understood reality that the risk of disasters emerges from the intersection of three important criteria: hazard, the nature and severity of the event, exposure, and vulnerability. Building resilience requires understanding the way that all three of these interact. The primary focus of this special report was understanding changes in the nature and the severity of the events as a consequence of climate change, but it's also important to recognize that climate change can impact vulnerability and that it can impact prospects for sustainable development and feedback onto exposure. The report has three primary conclusions that I want to mention very, very briefly. The first is that observations make it clear that climate and weather extremes are increasing, and projections make it clear that they will continue to increase in the future. The evidence is solid on four categories of extremes. Extremes of high temperature, heat waves, have increased in the record or projected to increase in the future. The fraction of rainfall that falls as heavy precipitation has increased over most land areas in the last 50 years and is projected to increase more in the future. Several parts of the world have seen increases in the length and severity of droughts in the last 50 years. This has been particularly true in Africa, and it's projected to be true in the future. We know we have a substantial amount of sea level rise that we've already encountered. Storm surge on top of that is getting to be a more and more serious problem as a consequence of the sea level rise that's already occurred. To just provide a very brief flavor for the kind of changes that are projected with confidence, for extreme heat events, we project by the later decades of the century a tenfold increase in extreme heat events. Now think about this, very sobering conclusion. What is currently in any region the most severe heat wave in a decade, by the end of the century has the potential to become an annual event. The most severe heat wave in a decade becomes an annual event over much of the land area of the world. The second conclusion is that losses from climate-related disasters have clearly increased over the last 40 years or so. Increasing exposure is the major cause for this, but when you look at the disaster losses, it's clear that there are important regional differences. Most of the economic losses have been in the world's developed countries. Something like 95% of the fatalities associated with climate-related disasters in the last 40 years have been in the developing parts of the world. A striking difference in where there's a need and the kinds of need. The third major conclusion from the report is the optimistic one. It's that there are many opportunities for interventions that can recognize the changing profile of risk and deal with it in an effective way. And in particular, the report concludes that many of the most effective strategies for reducing disaster risk fall into the category of low regrets, so that investments now can reduce disaster risk at the same time they contribute to long-term sustainable development goals. And I want to highlight a few conclusions that actualize this finding. The first is that it's almost always better in the context of experience to invest in a portfolio of actions rather than a single silver bullet. And that portfolio should include activities to communicate risk, to reduce risk, to transfer risk, and to respond when disasters occur. Second, it's almost always better to invest in a multi-hazard approach to building resilience than in a focus on a single kind of hazard type. Third, there are important differences in the roles that are available and important for actors at different scale. There are roles for local scale actors, national scale actors, regional scale actors, and international actors. And finally, it's important to recognize that within the scientific community, within the development community, we don't have all the answers now, and that much of the potential for the progress is going to be unleashed by an iterative approach, learning through doing, but starting doing now. If there's a key finding from the approach and the report and the message that I want to leave all of you with today, it's that there are opportunities that have not yet been capitalized on that come from a more effective integration of climate change adaptation, disaster risk management, and sustainable development. And the question that I hope the panel can address in the comments that follow these are, how do we go from the principles that the IPCC has laid out very clearly to making them a reality? I look forward to your comments, and thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Field, for that expert technical input into the panel discussion we're going to have. Before that, though, we thought we would have a little political input. Now, earlier today in this building, the group of people met called the Political Champions for Disaster Resilience. Taking part in that meeting was Andrew Mitchell, who is the Secretary of State for International Development for the United Kingdom, and we thought we would ask him to tell us about that event and how it relates to this one. So, Mr. Secretary.
Well, good afternoon, colleagues. Let me report back briefly from what happened this morning at the meeting of political champions, which I co-chair with Helen Clark. Also with us as a political champion was Valerie Amos from OCHA, Rachel Kite from the World Bank, Kristalina Georgieva from ECHO, Gunilla Carlsson, my colleague from Sweden, Raj Shah, my colleague from the US of A, Rowan Douglas, who is a private sector insurance expert from Willis Re, and Mr. Ribeiro from Mozambique, and Mr. Yamamoto from Japan. And we set ourselves an agenda. This was our first meeting, although we had an opportunity during UNGA in New York last year to come together to address a number of issues. We set out to look at what we could do to help. Obviously, we don't want to duplicate other issues that are being addressed. We want to try and make sure that we focus effectively on a few key areas, that we divide up the tasks upon which we will lead, and that we meet just 2 or 3 times a year in the margins of meetings like this. The next one probably in the margins of the Tokyo meeting in October, to take stock of what is happening and what more we can do to assist. We looked very specifically at enhancing risk assessment and financing, which was led by Rachel. We looked at the lessons to be learnt from regional resilience in the Horn of Africa and the new Global Alliance, which I think Raj will be talking about shortly. We looked at the issue of long-term resilience in the Sahel and the issues which confront us there under Valerie from OCHA, and we considered too what other deliverables we could pursue, in particular driving public-private sector innovation, and also trying to make sure that we as donors get our own houses in order. And in that particular connection, I made it clear that DFID, my department, by 2015 would embed resilience in all of the work that we are doing to confront the issues that were so eloquently set out in the presentation we have just heard. I think we were particularly keen also to focus on the very steep increase in disaster prevalence, looking at the figures over 2011, and also the expert guidance for how disasters, humanitarian disasters, are likely to gather in strength, in scope and scale over the next few years. In Britain, we have had the benefit of the Ashdown report on what more can be done to address the issues of disasters, and one of its main conclusions is precisely the issue that we are discussing now and which we were discussing this morning, and also to try and harness particularly the role of the private sector and insurance in this, as in so many other aspects of humanitarian resilience and humanitarian work. So I hope that the political champions will be a good servant of the international network engaged in these issues, that we can try and galvanise support and effort where appropriate, and that we can ensure also that lessons that are learnt as we advance on this agenda are widely disseminated and gathered for everyone's advantage, not least those who suffer most acutely from these disasters, who are, of course, the poorest and most vulnerable in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Very good. We now are going to move into our panel discussion. I'm going to invite the panelists up to the stage. They're going to talk about some of the issues that have been raised here, and you will have an opportunity perhaps to pose some questions yourselves afterwards. So let me call the panelists in order one by one. Hold your applause, please. We'll welcome them all collectively when they're on stage. Helen Clark is the administrator of the United Nations Development Program. Ms. Clark, we have a chair for you here. Armida Alice Jabana is the Minister of National Development Planning for the Government of Indonesia. Welcome. Rachel Kite is the Vice President of Sustainable Development here at the World Bank. Valerie Amos is the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator of the United Nations. And as you've heard, Rajiv Shah is the Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. The panelists are here, and moderating this discussion, as she did last year, will be Zani Minton-Beddoes, who is the Economics Editor of The Economist. Yes.
Dialogue. Woo! Feel like a gathering of old friends. But it's a gathering of old friends who've just heard some very bracing news. That was an incredibly sobering report from the IPCC, certainly for me, and I assume for most of you. And I think it's the challenge that you laid out, and I'm afraid I didn't scribble fast enough, so it's not going to be quite word for word, but I mean, you laid out in your presentation excellently a portfolio of solutions that are necessary, and you had a very clear way of describing what's needed, which is integrating climate change adaptation, disaster risk management, and sustainable development. A modest challenge, but it's one that I think this panel needs to rise to, which is, how do you do it? What are the solutions, and how do you actually, what does this translate into on the ground? And I think that's kind of where I'd like this conversation to go. And perhaps, Valerie, can we start with you? And can you give us a sense, and let's start with something concrete, the lessons from the Horn of Africa experience, and how are you going to translate those into I'm afraid, what we're seeing happening in the Sahel? I mean, what have you learnt, and what concretely are we doing differently?
Well, thank you. I think we've learnt a lot, but I'll focus on three things, if I may. I think the first thing is that with the Horn response, we've been criticised for moving too slowly. We knew it was coming. We didn't manage to raise the funds, and it was only when we saw those terrible pictures on our television screens that we were able to mobilise as an international community to really get the resources that we required. I think that we've heeded the early warning this time, and we've moved much more quickly. The second thing is that in terms of building the relationship between what we do on the humanitarian side and making sure that we're linking with our colleagues on the development side, we are firmly behind country-led strategies. We're talking about 9 countries in the Sahel. They're not at the same place or moving at the same pace. We've got problems, as you all know, with security in Mali, which is having a huge impact in terms of refugee flows. But even with all of that, countries themselves are taking the lead. We are supporting their response, because if we don't do that, we're not really building the resilience bit into this. Of course, it means that the pace of this is not necessarily as quick as we would like, but I think in the long term this is going to deliver real benefits. And the third thing is that our donors have put money behind this, and this is really important. If we're going to really shift from just reacting to preparing and responding to early warning, then there needs to be money behind it. So those are 3 key learnings. And I'd say one other thing, which is that this is really about recognizing, and it's a point that Chris made in his presentation, which is that we used to see drought, for example, in the Horn of Africa, severe drought, I should say, because we know that there's drought, every 10 years or so. I myself have spoken to communities who've said this, but that they're now seeing it every 2 years. So this is about helping people to survive that severe drought. It's about helping communities to be more robust, to be more resilient. And to do that, we need strong political leadership in country, but also support from the international community. And it links very clearly to the work that we are doing as political champions for the resilience agenda. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's a great overview of what's happening in Africa. And I turn to a different part of the world, maybe with you now, and ask you what you've learned since those terrible events, which seem, frankly, to be really like yesterday still in many ways, but how much has changed in your own country's approach to resilience and to development and budgetary planning, and kind of how you deal with things since the tsunami?
Thank you very much, Zani, for the question. Before I respond to your question, let me give you a perspective on what Indonesia faces in terms of risks on these natural disasters. Let me just quote you from my note. Indonesia, for the past 10 years, has on average 100 disasters per year, each with human casualties. So although the extent of the economic impact at the national level is relatively low, only 0.3% of GDP, this is mainly because of the large size of the Indonesia's economy. However, the regional and subnational impacts are quite significant. To give you the perspective on the unfortunate event of the large earthquake and tsunami in Aceh in 2004 that you are referring to. It cost around $4.5 billion in damage and losses, or about 45% of the regional GDP. So almost half of Aceh economy at that time was wiped out. And then the less severe one, 2009, in West Sumatra earthquake, cost around $2.3 billion in damage and losses, or about 30% of West Sumatra's regional GDP. So this is just to give you the perspective of what Indonesia has to face in terms of the risk of these natural disasters. And since the unfortunate event of 2004 and several others, unfortunate event of natural disaster, of course, Indonesia has to be able to face this risk in a more systematic manner. Therefore, 2007, we set up the National Agency for Disaster Management. So this institution, its task is to coordinate all the mitigation and mitigation efforts, as well as the disaster relief operation once the disaster occurs. And also with that, Indonesia has, in a more systematic manner, tried to prepare for this unfortunate occurrence, trying to set up the early warning systems, especially in the high-risk areas. And also, of course, we have to prepare the people, from socializing, train the people, for them to prepare for the occurrence of disaster, especially, again, in prone areas. And then we also set up the disaster relief procedures, and we also set up the more coordinated efforts for the relief operation and reconstruction and rehabilitation. Certain amount of funding is set aside in our budget as a disaster relief contingency funding, should the need arises. And of course, since we are in the planning ministry, we also try to mainstream disaster preparedness since the planning stage. And we have this roadmap, a blueprint, a 5-year, and especially for those areas, districts, provinces that are very prone to disaster. So we have this metrics and how to for them to better prepare.
How does that translate into your preparedness? I mean, just last week there was a large earthquake.
About 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, right.
Something that we collectively held our breath and feared a terrible disaster. Could you give some sense of concrete ways in which those reforms, those things that you put into place now, made you feel better prepared had it been worse?
Yeah, at least, in for example, 2 weeks ago, again an earthquake, but fortunately there was no tsunami in Aceh, in Aceh, and at the time, at least, because people were more prepared this time, so at least they already know the escape route, right? They know where to go, right? At that time, and of course the early warning system, although some of the early warning system wasn't in effect because I don't know, technical problem. So then we try to make sure that next time it works.
But at least it is.
So people already know where to go, how to be more prepared, things like that.
We have a lot of panelists and not very much time, so I guess I'm going to turn, Rachel, to you. Whoa, scarf here. We had, the managing director gave a sort of overview of what the bank was doing, but maybe you could make that a little bit more concrete and tell us how, because now we've got the institutions, and those of you who haven't spoken yet, I want to give Rajiv your perspective from USAID, but Rachel, first from the bank, what's the bank's role in building this resilience, but particularly with this component of climate change that is now you're rightly adding from, the conversation we had 6 months ago was humanitarian and disaster response into the development integration. Now we're integrating another dimension. Is the bank doing that? Is it integrated within the bank?
Well, we're on a journey. Over the last 3 years, 2/3 of our country assistance strategies now have started to build in disaster risk management in there. I think the next part of the journey is to get to 100%, but it's really to, in our dialogue with government, and then in the assistance strategies, and then in the way in which we think about the infrastructure that needs to be built over the next 10 years, whether that's water or energy or roads or large dams, etc., that we're building in resilience into the way we think about that, into design, but not just design, into the software that goes around these programs as well, how communities are resilient and how communities that are resilient interact with the infrastructure that you build for them. So I think it's got to become even more front of mind than it is at the moment. Just 5 years ago, we were struggling to work out how climate change and development really fit together. The strategic framework on development and climate change sort of set the scene for that. I think 5 years later, fast forward, we know that we are in an adaptation institution. Everything we do has to be factoring in climate change adaptation, and all forms of development have to build adaptation into the way in which we think about them. So I think that we're trying to keep ahead of that curve, but as we know more, so we need to be thinking differently about the way we think about infrastructure, the way we think about support to communities, their health, their education, and how we think about the use of technology as well. I think the optimism that we have in the bank is that we know that technology, open data, and access to information can actually help developing countries leapfrog, and they don't have to go through sort of the painful mistakes that we've made in the developed world. Everything from the design of cities and the design of the infrastructure for cities. But also, I'll give you a really good example. A few weeks ago, there was a tornado storm in Dallas-Fort Worth area, right? You go up I-270, nice little small, medium-sized American company. It's got a technology which we've been talking to them about bringing into South Asia, East Asia and Africa, which measures the lightning in the clouds, not the lightning when it lands on the ground. Now, the National Weather System of the United States and all kinds of developed countries measure lightning as it hits the ground. Do you know what the time difference was because of the technology of measuring it in the clouds versus on the ground? This little SME up in Maryland beat the National Weather Service by 9 minutes. 9 minutes. Now, 9 minutes when you've got a lot of 737s on the ground is a lot of money. I think that we can bring that kind of technology to our clients, and I think that's the kind of sort of integrated front-of-mind approach that we have to bring to the way we work going forward.
Rajiv, what are you doing to integrate this? Do you know about the SME in
I didn't know about this, and I have, but it sounds fascinating and very important. I think I'd start by saying, since we last met and had that discussion, I think all of us are trying to do very concrete and specific things. The challenge we should ask ourselves, and if we have the luxury of meeting 6 months from now, is what in the most vulnerable places is actually happening on the ground. And I would argue that despite our best institutional efforts, not as much is happening in concrete terms, and there are a lot of reasons for that we could get into. The U.S. is really trying to do, as everybody else, quite a lot. Our global climate change initiative is fundamentally about resilience. We have focused very much on really the Horn of Africa as an example where we need to figure out how to get it right, and where we have to just get concrete about specific examples. Mahmoud Malim is here to help, who just chaired, on behalf of IGAD, a big meeting in Nairobi that brought together donor partners, local leaders, the countries themselves. These countries have strong resilience plans. Everybody knows what we need to do. They're pastoral communities that need to be connected to a regional and integrated economy. I had the chance to visit precisely one of those areas in the Somali region of Ethiopia. You walk into a market. By creating a market for pastoralists to sell livestock, they can all of a sudden access very lucrative markets in that region, including in the Middle East, and including at times when prices and values for their livestock are very, very high. People wouldn't necessarily think that building a livestock market is a resilience strategy, but by helping precisely the most vulnerable communities, it is. And then when you ask yourself, well, why are we not doing enough of that? It comes down to a lot of things. These are not politically connected, politically powerful communities. That's why they're vulnerable. These aren't places where there's a lot of public infrastructure. That's why the vulnerability is so acute. So for us, we use this meeting in part to launch this effort, including this global alliance for resilience that we're very much hoping will be a mechanism for all of us to coordinate and ensure that the actions we're taking as institutions is generating concrete results on the ground for those communities. And importantly, that there's a way to measure the outcome. Both the EU and the U.S. announced some major programs for resilience in the Horn. we struggled a lot with how do you measure what success looks like. And we ultimately came up with a model that allowed us to say, by doing this, we're going to protect 1 million people over time that will, in a similar drought, will not need humanitarian assistance. But that kind of modeling is still, I think, relatively rudimentary, and the community of leaders here should be working together more aggressively to really figure out what are the concrete results that we can measure, report on, and be confident that our actions are making a big difference.
How much do you feel that the resilience framework and the kind of comprehensive methodology is integrated in your own organization? Because there seem to be many levels of needing to integrate within one, breaking down silos, between, and then with partner countries. Let's think of the simplest level, your own one.
Well,
six months or the end of the journey?
Yeah, 6 months ago we lamented how hard it was. We didn't solve everything in 6 months. But we have every one of our missions around the world is creating a country development cooperation strategy that will be inclusive of resilience, much like the UK announced. We now spend about 15% of our OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which is about $1 billion a year, specifically on resilience from that vehicle alone. We've reoriented our global climate change and much of our development portfolios, particularly in agriculture, where we're focusing more on dry lands and climate resilient systems and technologies that support that to pursue a resilience agenda. And I think just as importantly, we want to use the political leadership and capacity of the United States to support partners like Mahbub and others to really build up their own capacity to make sure that we don't do what we did last year. And to be clear about what we all did last year, we funneled in humanitarian assistance when we needed to, but we spent far more on chasing humanitarian objectives after a disaster than we did to prevent it. And we need to fundamentally change that equation, and we need to make sure that the resources we spend drive real results.
Helen, turning to you now, how do you, I think you call it resilience-based sustainable development, right? The UNDP. Everyone has a slightly different combination of these phrases, but how are you translating that into concrete action within UNDP? What's the way it's being applied to your programs?
Well, I'm talking about resilience-based approaches to sustainable development, because if you don't have a basic level of resilience, you can't hang on to the gains that you've got when adversity and shock comes along. And adversity and shock we're focusing on today is the natural disaster. But, of course, there's lots of other examples of adversity and shock, from the economic to its social fallout to the fragile state which degenerates into a state of war. Development gains get lost in each of these kinds of shocks. So we're saying that resilience really needs to be at the very centre of development strategies. And I think what is so encouraging about what we're hearing now from the major players in the development partner community, from the US, the EU, DFID, and then with so many of the countries we're working with, they are really looking to make this so central to strategy. So I feel quite optimistic that we really might make some breakthroughs. Second point I want to make is that the communities we're talking about are innately very resilient communities. If you have lived for millennia in the Horn or in the Sahel, you are resilient. But as our friend Chris from the International Panel for Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel, said, the risks are going to a new level, and this is putting more pressure on communities living in heavily stressed environments than ever before. And so I think where the development partners can focus is on how do we support to shift up to the new levels of threat. And I think, speaking for Valerie and me, when we went to Niger, we were just so struck by the contrast between the community which had the opportunity with support from development partners to put in the water infrastructure versus the community that hadn't. And what was the difference? Healthy people in one community and truly distressed and extremely hungry and malnourished people in another. So very simple interventions can help. Where do we come in? I think very much on supporting the building of the institutions and the capacities to rise to the challenge of having the plan, integrating the policies and carrying it out. And also in sharing experience from what approaches which have been seen to work. I mean, Indonesia is an incredible example of how to learn from the Aceh disaster, and we saw that in play with the early warnings just in the last couple of weeks. Bangladesh has a great story to tell, so does Mozambique. There are many great stories, so if we can share the experience, ensure that resilience is going to the heart of the strategy, then I feel optimistic.
I came, I'm obviously not an expert on this, but having had the privilege of moderating your first dialogue, the sobering things that I've heard about the pace at which you're going to have to do this. I mean, the things are happening so fast. If those very sort of striking stats you have, that it's going to be an annual event now to have an extreme heat event. That means time is not on your side to do this, and so it strikes me that we should perhaps talk about three things very briefly, which I think is what came out from that presentation. One is you've got to get the priorities right. What are the priorities, given how fast you have to do this? Two, you've got to be coherent, and you address this. And then thirdly, what actually concretely you're going to do. And so in the time that we've got left, I was going to ask, perhaps we'll start with the Indonesian example again, because you've really successfully laid out priorities and delivered on those priorities. What do you see as the priorities now? What is top of your agenda right now in pushing this resilience, strengthening your resilience going forward?
As I mentioned earlier, that we already have this institution that the main task is to coordinate from the disaster relief operation until also all these mitigation efforts. So this institution that coordinates that. And I think the priority is for all of us to socialize to the people, and also to train the people, especially those people that resides in the disaster-prone areas, so they are more ready when the unfortunate event should occur. That's one. And also, second, of course, the infrastructure has to be in place. And with that is the early warning system and things like that, as well as try in stages to make sure that the infrastructure, such as the buildings and so on, also conform to the codes. Therefore, these buildings in these disaster-prone areas can withstand a certain level of shocks. And that's one. And then second, for the institution itself, from time to time, what they do is they held this joint exercise with our several of our development partners to join this exercise for disaster relief operation. We call it also part of our military were involved. We call it military operation other than war. So joint exercise, supported, facilitated also by our military personnel, and jointly with several other countries. We already held that, I think, once or twice, and we are going to hold that, I think, next year.
And do you have any lessons you can draw from the fact that you have done so much coordination already, and what it is that makes coordination work? How can you do it successfully?
I think the key is that we have this one institution that coordinates everything, rather than piecemeal.
Well, we have 4 institutions, 5 institutions, 4 institutions on this panel, so we're not doing terribly well at that so far. But you have to work, and Rachel, I'm going to address this to you, but I'm also going to address it at Valerie, you afterwards. You have to coordinate between institutions. You have to coordinate within your institution, make sure there's no silos within your institution. How, and you said you were starting down a journey, but how do you make sure that, given that we don't have very much time, you maximize coherence around you? We've got resilience now, we all know about resilience, we know about the components. How do you make sure you are all on the same page and working coherently together?
Well, first of all, I think that we're a lot better at it than we are before, and necessity is the mother of invention. And I think within the development community, we've got better at coordinating through the last few years of shock after shock after shock. And then I think, frankly, sadly but true, the humanitarian and the development community now work much better together as a result of the Horn and as a result of the Sahel. I think, with Kristalina and Valerie leading on the humanitarian side and with the other bilaterals, we actually have the kind of dialogue that we've desperately needed for the last 20 years about what's the handoff and how do we really see things together. And also, because there just isn't the cash around, we can't afford, as Raj was saying, to spend the money on humanitarian assistance chasing after the disaster. So I think that we have got better at that. And then I think it's each to whose best talent, right? So what are you good at, what are you good at, and then dividing that up and working together. So what are we good at? Well, first of all, getting information into people's hands. It's a collaborative effort, but I think that's an absolute priority. If people don't have information, they can't make decisions. And that's at the country level, at the city level, and at the community level. The second is helping people make different investment choices. Don't make investment choices that are going to lock you into an irreversibility that you can ill afford in a world of greater uncertainty and greater risk. And I think that, again, the development partners, that's sort of on the development side of things, I think we're getting better at that. And the third then is, as Helen was saying, people are incredibly resilient. They're resilient in the way that they manage their money, they're resilient in the way that they manage their resources, and the way that they manage family health, etc. So what we need to do is put tools in their hands that help increase that resilience, and that's working with the private sector on weather information, and then the insurance tools that you can get, using the fact that we've got much more access to finance than we ever used to, we've got more access to mobile technology than we ever used to, using those platforms to put new resilience techniques into the hands of the poor. And I think that's the kinds of things that we're good at, and then working with everybody else with their talents and everybody bringing it together. I think you're starting to see the kind of coordination the world needs.
Valerie, what's your perspective? You're at the shorter-term emergency response end of the spectrum. How do you see the progress in coordination, and what else needs to be done?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I think that there's a big driver for change, and I think that part of that drive is that people are fed up. And yes, people are resilient, but people also have more information, there's better communication, and they know that it doesn't have to be like that. And then the people in the countries which have, traditionally given substantial amounts of money are also fed up, because they say, we see this year after year, how come you guys can't get your act together, and how come you can't improve on this? Why should people die from famine? And I think they're absolutely right. It's inexcusable that people die from famine. So the big challenge for all of us, I think, is how do we join up better? We're talking about a huge kind of stakeholder base, if you like. And I think one of the things that's challenged us in the past is we've looked at this, and it's this kind of complicated web of different actors and different people with a stake in this, and it's like, where do you start? Well, the reality is that you start in as many places as you can, because, in helping communities to build their capacity to respond and be more sustainable, you're helping them. In helping countries to do what they require to do at an institutional level, you're making progress. Our organisations becoming more efficient and effective at this and working more closely together. That delivers as a result too. And really focusing on what difference is our work making, what's the impact. Raj tells us all the time, as does Andrew, that they want to see, what are the results. What difference is the money that we are putting into this making? We need to be much better at looking at the impact, so that we know what is really working. And I think the last thing I would say is that we have to learn the lessons. There are lots of lessons out there. We can't pretend that they're not. There are lots of countries that have managed to do this. I think we all know that supporting country priorities is absolutely critical as well, and that you have to support the building of capacity in country. But we can't look at it and say it's so complicated we don't know where to start. We have to start in as many different places as possible and then bring all of that together.
But you have to prioritise within that too. I mean, you have to start as many different places as possible. But
yes, we do. But I think we also have to recognise that there are so many players in this, that bringing everyone, facing the same direction will take some time. But if you get a key group of players doing that. And I think that 6 months ago we had a meeting. We were talking about facing in the same direction. I think a number of us actually are now. I think that's really important. Holding each other accountable is key to that. Different institutions saying, well, I'll take, putting up their hands and saying, I'll take the lead on that. That's all making a real difference.
Raj, do you agree that last 6 months progress has been made on that? And you mentioned that your experience in the Horn of Africa, and you laid out how, in fact, things had improved there. How do you, one question is, how do you sustainably translate this into action at the country level? I mean, it's one thing to have these discussions, it's one thing to all be standing and looking in the same direction, working better together, but then translate it into action.
Well, let me start with two statistics. One is since 2002, the United States of America has spent $11.2 billion on humanitarian assistance in the Horn of Africa, chasing the problem after the fact, and far less on resilience ahead of time, by orders of magnitude. So we want the next decade to be the exact opposite, because that's both smarter and more effective and efficient. The second fact is that in the Horn, in the context of a huge growing population and more people in vulnerable areas, we're actually seeing with each drought, and remember last year's was the worst drought in 6 decades, less actual fatalities and humanitarian burden. So it's hard to get your head around that when you're looking at a disaster in the light of the disaster, because we're so focused on providing for critical needs then. But in general, we are actually building resilience just far too slowly. So given that, I'd go back and I'd just say 2 things. One is, I think the country plan has to be the key coordinating factor. And remember that no country wants to be a recipient of humanitarian assistance on a regular basis. The countries seek as a path to both dignity and progress and power to have a different narrative. And I think we saw that in the Nairobi Declaration last September, and I think we see that in the very strong country plans that have been developed already in those areas. Second, I would prioritize, and this may be controversial, so I'll go ahead and take a risk. But I would prioritize in that sweet spot of programmatic investments that essentially align economic growth and resilience strategies. The reason I like the livestock example so much is because that's both a resilience strategy and it's an economic development strategy for that region, and it's how these countries can build significant economic value overall as a percentage of their agricultural economies. So when you find things like that, those are the ones that I think we ought to really be fully investing in. And that begs the question then, well, what's a secondary or a third order piece? And we should be honest about the fact that in the limited resource environment, we do have to pick those kinds of priorities and make those tough choices.
And you very frankly and honestly said that given the scale and the pace at which things are happening, there isn't yet enough focus on resilience. Helen, do you agree with that very briefly? I mean, do you, I'm going to put you on the spot a bit, what grade do you give yourselves on how would you give the group on how you're doing, given the scale of the challenge that lies ahead?
I think it's come ahead light years with everyone reflecting on the cost of the mega disasters. I mean, there's just been so many this last 7 or so years, going back to the Boxing Day tsunami, through the Pakistan floods, Haiti, the Horn, the Sahel, 2 years ago, the Sahel again now. So I think the message is very, very clear. Don't wait for the next one. We know there's going to be, at some time, another earthquake in Haiti. We know at some point there's going to be another earthquake and probably a tsunami off the coast of Indonesia. We know there'll be cyclones in the Bay of Bengal and the Philippines. We know there's going to be drought in the Sahel. So what can we do as development partners to support countries to put the institutions and capacities in place to mitigate the effects of that? That's what it's about. We cannot, given the increasing scale and intensity of disaster and growing populations in the way of it, afford to pay these mega billions year after year. So I think it's a very practical realisation that's got us all to that. I just wanted to pick up on one point that Chris Field made about the opportunity to integrate across sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation. You know, if we put together what's available for official development assistance and make sure it's used in a catalytic way to support resilience. If we put that together with the Green Fund, which will come on stream, which again should be catalytic, and the very large finance that is going to be out there of a market kind for adaptation, I think we can make these things work together. I think there are opportunities, but it requires integrated thinking, not siloed thinking, as we've been accustomed to in the past.
But you're making some progress towards that, it sounds like. But still more to do.
Oh, more to do, but you know, I think the realisation's well and truly there, and as I say, I'm really encouraged by the major players all getting to the same point. A stitch in time saves 9.
Particularly when there's going to be, no, I'm going to get this metaphor wrong. Stitch in time saves 9, but there's going to be more coming. I'm going to
more stitches or something.
And more that doesn't go anywhere. We are running out of time, but to conclude, I wanted to ask, in the interest of focusing this on action and the interest of focusing it forward, to think forward to the annual meetings in Tokyo. The next time, maybe you will have a resilience dialogue. It's going to be a priority at those annual meetings, resilience, disaster risk reduction in general. Give me one recommendation that you think that you would want to take to the Ministers of Finance, to the development ministers for that meeting. One briefly, you know, in 30 seconds, one thing that they should focus on that should be a priority. Helen, with you.
One thing, have a good look at your development assistance budget and ensure that a good proportion of it is focusing on resilience.
We need to put more focus and attention to adaptation measures, not only mitigation.
Adaptation. Rachel?
Yeah, I agree with my colleague from Indonesia, and I think that we have to put in front of ministers of finance from developing countries a different data set that allows them to make a different set of investment choices, factoring in the short-term versus long-term gains of different decisions, investment in infrastructure and agriculture, and we have to bring that data set to them because that's not commonly available, but that's the challenge.
So more information. Valerie?
Invest in risk management and preparedness.
I'd say develop a simple, easy-to-use, easy-to-apply measure for what success looks like for resilience investments.
Well, that sounds like a pretty good list of priorities to take. So we can, next time you meet, you can not only have laid them out, but then we can start seeing how far they've been put into practice at the country level, at the organisation level as well. And we'll see, I didn't actually get a grade, so I'm not going to push that, but improve the grade. You know, when you're with your children, it says effort. You know, the effort grade should go up at least. Thank you all very, very much.
We have some closing remarks on the road ahead. First, we will hear from Dario Luna, who is, where is Mr. Luna? Are you in? There you are. Who is the head of Insurance, Pension, and Social Security for the Ministry of Finance in Mexico and the coordinator of the Disaster Risk Management Agenda for the Mexican G20 presidency. Mr. Luna.
On behalf of the Mexican presidency of the G20, and in particular of Under Minister Gerardo Rodriguez, I would like to thank the organizers of this dialogue for the opportunity to speak, to brief you on what has been going on the G20 this year. We in Mexico have given a lot of importance to disaster risk management because of the we're a country prone to disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanoes, and we wanted to take the opportunity in the presidency of the G20 to set the topic in the agenda not only of G20 countries but also of finance ministers. And I think with what we just heard, there hasn't been more opportune time to do so. One of the key aspects, I guess, of the changing world is the increasing exposure to natural disasters that most countries are facing. And as it was said before, a fact that is caused by the rising trend in frequency and severity of these events, but also by the dramatic changes we have seen in terms of urbanization throughout the world. The G20 has recognized this, and we have recognized that exposure to natural disasters can translate into significant economic and financial losses that have an impact on long-term growth. So for us, the topic of this year's resilience dialogue could not be much more opportune. This year's G20, we're working to promote the use of science and technology to better assess risk and to better finance risk, not only for G20 countries but also for non-G20 countries. And the aim is to better prepare countries to reduce the economic impacts of this. Of course, the human this would also bring much benefits on the human impact of disasters, but we believe that the finance ministers have a role in better assessing the impact on the economic side. For that reason, we have set in the deputy finance ministers meeting in last January, there has been a formal request to the World Bank and the OECD to develop two deliverables. First, we've asked them to produce a joint publication with the Mexican presidency on sharing country experiences on how risk assessment and risk financing can help gain resilience and economic resilience of countries. Second, we've also asked them to build a set of policy tools that can be voluntary and open to country circumstances and that can be used by G20 countries and non-G20 countries. So as you can see, this is based on knowledge, a lot of knowledge sharing. This week, we've had 2 very intense days of the G20 meetings in finance ministers. And there was a meeting of G20 countries on Wednesday to actually engage with the World Bank and the OECD on these 2 key deliverables. And we found that there was ample support of the G20 for this initiative. More than 22 countries participated on the dialogue. And the value of knowledge sharing and exchanging experiences was really highlighted. Also, we have seen that the publication, the first deliverable, which will be set to be presented in the June summit in Mexico in Los Cabos, is gaining a lot of track. We've had between 15 and 17 contributions from countries who will be sharing the way they are either successfully assessing risk and gaining resilience, or trying to show us what is the road ahead in their own countries and the challenges that they are facing. And we believe that this publication will be key to lead the work in future G20 work. Later this year, by November, we will have the policy recommendations on risk assessments, and we will also be sharing that with the broader G20 community and non-G20 community. We believe that through these efforts, the topic of disaster risk management will be gaining much more relevance in the minds of finance ministers and G20 countries in a way that we can share very sound knowledge and developments that have been taking place in our countries, and share that with non-G20 countries, developing countries, and to help reduce the future impact of natural disasters. So we really appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today, and we look forward to sharing much more information and knowledge throughout the rest of the year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Luna. And finally, to conclude, we are going to hear from Naoki Ishii, who is the Deputy Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs with the Government of Japan. And as I mentioned, the Government of Japan is one of the co-hosts of this event this evening.
I think. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to everybody. It is my real honor to close the second Resilience Dialogue on the fitting theme of preparing for a changing world. In the first Resilience Dialogue at the annual meeting last September, co-hosted by Japan, the European Union, and the World Bank, we affirmed the importance of closing the loop between emergency responses and resilient recovery for sustainable development. Today's event has allowed us to deepen the discussion on coordinating international, national, and regional efforts for a more integrated delivery of disaster risk management and climate change adaptation on the ground. As we noted, the international community currently faces multiple challenges on a global basis: ongoing financial crisis, climate changes, inequality, and joblessness. To achieve poverty reduction and sustainable growth, it is critical the management of various risks be integrated into development policy thinking. Doing so, we must pay particular attention to those who are most vulnerable to shocks: the poor, women and children, the disabled, the elderly, and other marginalized groups. We witnessed natural disasters are increasingly becoming severe, frequent, unpredictable, and non-linear. Accordingly, our response system is required to build in resilience in order to predict, absorb, and respond timely to those shocks. The response system will be multi-pronged, from infrastructure to technology to the process to the institution and behavioral changes. Harnessing and tapping local knowledge is critical to build resilience to the response system. Today we discussed how the international community can work together with countries and societies under these threats to build those response systems. The very timely report by IPCC and presented by Dr. Christopher Field make it so clear that disaster risk management and climate change adaptation are essentially two sides of the same coin. They need to be incorporated across various sectors as a key component of development policy. Similarly, working together as we have committed to doing today is absolutely crucial to integrate the humanitarian, development, and climate change adaptations actions for sustainable development. We are also working with the G20 Mexican presidency, which has initiated a project to establish the framework for disaster risk assessment and financing, which was just introduced by Mr. Dario Luna. And taking this opportunity, I'd like to congratulate Mr. Luna of Mexican Ministry of Finance for Mexico's extraordinary leadership on this matter. I am here today to reaffirm Japanese commitment to working with you on building resilience to disaster risks. we are already partnering with the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, GFDRR, to promote knowledge exchange and coordinating strategies in support for sustainable development and how to build that resilience into the system. We will share these lessons in the Sendai Dialogue that we are organizing during the October 2012 IMF World Bank annual meetings. By the way, Sendai is located in the Tohoku prefecture that bore the brunt of the tsunami last year. The objective of this Sendai Dialogue is to develop a global consensus to mainstream disaster risk reduction as a development priority. We hope the discussion in Sendai, along with the annual meetings in Tokyo, will send a clear signal to the community that building disaster resilience should become an integral part of planning and financing for sustainable development. I truly look forward to continuing this dialogue and seeing you again in Tokyo and Sendai in October this year. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Ishii, and the event has come to a close. Thank you. I wanted to signal as well Commissioner Piebalgs from the European Union for co-hosting this event along with the government of Japan and the GFDRR and the World Bank. There are some refreshments outside. We invite you to stop and chat if you wish with some of the panelists and to meet and greet each other as well. So thank you very much again.